All right, we can begin.
Welcome to the Algae Biomass Summit Industry Spotlight Panel, Algae and Animal Feeds, Effective Market Entry. I'm pleased to moderate this impressive panel, which exemplifies this year's summit theme, Algae 2020, Sustainable Scalable Solutions. Before I introduce our panel and our panelists, I want to take a moment to familiarize you with our virtual format. This year, the summit has initiated with the first ever industry spotlight panels. If you missed any of the initial spotlight panels, recordings of the stimulating presentations and subsequent discussions will be accessible to all summit attendees. Our next spotlight panel will be next Tuesday, September 1st, and will focus on crop insurance for open pond algae production. September 8th through September 10th, the summit will move to a series of impressive keynote speakers and plenary panels covering important industry topics. Beginning on September 14th and running through October 1st, technical sessions and poster sessions will be available to all participants in 4 tracks: biology, engineering and analysis, products and markets, and finance, policy, and education. Please note that during this Zoom webinar today, we have an available chat feature where you can chat with your panelists and attendees of the webinar. If you have questions for the panelists or discussion points you would like to delve into with these panelists, please enter these into the Q&A feature. These questions and discussion points will be addressed at the end of the panel presentations, as well as in the follow-up discussions that can initiate using the Whova app and our panel discussion board in the community tab. The animal feed market provides a unique and valuable opportunity to the algae industry. Our industry has the incredible ability to provide valuable feed additives to improve the nutritional quality of our animal feeds in a sustainable way. The panel today will initiate with a deep dive into the animal feed market value proposition from 2 industry-leading experts from NutriQuest, Ryan Cooney and Dr. Chet Wernes. Martha Maripesi from Wiley LLP will then provide an in-depth look at what is required for regulatory approval to sell into these large markets. The panel presentations will end with Zevo Biosciences' Andrew Dahl and William Fund explaining how they are successfully positioning their company to move into animal feed markets with their new proprietary algae strain and product. My name is Valerie Harmon. I'm the president of Harmon Consulting Incorporated, a consulting company focused on bridging gaps in algae technology development. Whether you seek support in due diligence, regulatory dossiers, the transition from startup to commercial production, or production optimization, our company's depth of real-world commercial experience will support your success. Our client relationships are built on trust and confidentiality. You can rely on us to support you and to do so with tact and honesty. In the last 30 years, I have worked for Cyanotech Corporation, Aurora Algae, and Solana during my tenure in commercial algae production. I've spent 3 years selling Cyanotech's animal feed grade microalgae products. I'll be very interested to see how my personal experience will relate to what our panelists have to share with you today. Our first speaker today is Ryan Cooney. Ryan serves as the Vice President of Marketing at NutriQuest, where he has been employed since 2014. Ryan has been instrumental in NutriQuest's international market expansion, as well as their expansion into the dairy sector. He supports internal product development via collaborating with external technology companies, manages NutriQuest's IP portfolio, and works to remove obstacles to ingredient commercialization from manufacturing to regulatory approvals. Ryan has over 15 years of business development experience in nutrition and feed additive companies, including Hubbard Feeds, Ridley Inc., and SODA Feed Ingredients. Please join me in delving into learning about animal feed market opportunities from Ryan Cooney, Vice President of Marketing at NutriQuest.
Thank you, Valerie, for that introduction, and thank you to all the attendees for showing up here today as well. So in my talk in the next 10 minutes, I really want to just orient you to the feed industry a bit, give you some of the basics, sell you a little bit on how great it is, and give you some of the watch outs as well. Most of my info is going to be pretty high level, and as the speakers progress throughout the day, we'll get into some more details. I'll start just quickly with where NutriQuest fits, just so you have a understanding of the lens I'm looking through and a little of my bent and opportunities as I view them. NutriQuest is basically a team of industry-leading animal experts. We serve producers by trying to deliver targeted breakthrough solutions that really improve, those producers' profitability or fill an important need for them. We basically have a few things that we do really well. We know the market. We focus on collaboration, and we have capabilities to help jointly develop and commercialize technologies. And that's really one of the places that we excel is working with technology companies that have something, a concept, a product, an ingredient that they're interested in commercializing, and we bring it in, complete the research on it, and then have go-to-market teams to commercialize that technology. So here I just want to share some high-level terminology that you'll hear throughout the day. So feed ingredients, and feed additives are three terms that are often used in our industry. So feed really refers to this whole diet that you're looking at here. And this is the diet composition that's pretty typical for our industry. So this is typically described as a ton of feed, which is the complete feed that goes to animals. The feed ingredients are the individual ingredients and the more macro ingredients usually. So the ingredients listed on the right side, and then from the bottom up all the way to oats would all be really described as feed ingredients. And then feed additives is what's in this 3.1% that's up here in the upper left. And those are typically vitamins, minerals, and other feed additives, ingredients that enhance the feed by delivering some value is a way to think about feed additives. And there's really a wide range of what producers find, specific value in, but more often than not, cost and cost of production are going to be main drivers for a lot of those feed additives. So as you think about opportunities for algae, and what you see most often is in that feed additive space, the inclusion rates average 0.1%. Or 1 kilogram per ton of feed, so fairly low inclusion rates to keep in mind there as you think about the available space in a diet for a feed additive such as algae and how that could fit in. That's not written in stone anywhere by any means, and there's some other opportunities, but that would be pretty typical. So why animal feeds? As you think about where you can take your business and the markets you want to be in, what's attractive about the animal feed market? The number one reason is probably it's a huge market. The U.S. alone is 177 million tons of feed. So if you do some math and you were to treat each ton of feed with $3 of your product, that gets you to over $500 million market. You take the U.S. market and do the math to the worldwide market. The same number, kind of $3 per ton of feed. You're at a $3 billion market. So lots of opportunities within that size of market for algae and other ingredients for sure. The second reason I find that companies are often interested in animal feeds is it's very similar to what they're doing already. If they're producing food for human or pets, producing food for animal protein production, for meat, milk, or egg production is very similar. There's just a lot of crossover. One of the confusing things that happens is on the regulatory side where we talk about food instead of always calling it feed, even though there's kind of different and sometimes more stringent regulations for feed. But it really is food, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little later. But for many companies, if they've discovered a unique property or benefit from their algae that can be leveraged for human or pet food, that unique property or benefit can often be leveraged for animal food as well. And finally, on this point, I would just say that as you look at the landscape of opportunities for your business or for your algae, that the animal feed industry has lots of change occurring. There's room for improvement, and a need for new technologies, and that really creates an interesting opportunity. On top of that, you're playing a role in filling the demand for high quality protein, and that demand continues to increase, and that's helping to feed the world, and that can be really gratifying. So I'll switch to some trends in animal feeds here. And these aren't like future trends that might happen, but these are really trends that have happened recently and producers are still dealing with. They're searching for solutions. The biggest one is really market segmentation. It's an overriding trend, and it's been happening for a while, of course. And this is about the market segmentation of consumers' desires at the grocery and restaurant level, and how that rolls up the chain to production and feed. You know, a long time ago, market segmentation at grocery was if the consumer wanted beef, chicken, or pork, and that was kind of it. Now that segmentation is about giving the consumer a host of options. Some chicken examples are, you know, how it was raised, what it was fed, how quickly it grew, what size it is, and the traceability that goes with all of that. And that's been a driver in moving away from some regulated products as well. The shift to RWA, or raised without antibiotics, is the biggest one, and has had a huge impact on broiler and chicken industry, far and away more than any other species, although you see it as well in other species. Ractopamine is another regulated product that was used in swine, was used to promote growth, and that's pretty much gone away from the U.S. industry completely. BST in dairy cattle is another example of a regulated product that's gone away completely. So those things are happening for sure. You know, as those regulated products go away, there's kind of an opening there for I'll use the term natural, you know, an undefined term, but pretty much everyone knows what we mean, I think. But there's an opportunity for natural products to kind of backfill those spaces. They don't have drug effects or similar modes of action by any means, but through other effects, they can start to fill those spaces. As I go down the list here, zinc oxide, this is not a regulated product, but has kind of an antimicrobial and gut health effect in pigs, and is under pressure in many parts of the world, and is being regulated out in places, you know, all across Europe, for example, due largely to its buildup in soils. And then, you know, economics is the last one I list there. Not a trend necessarily, but it's important enough to talk about it several times. A main goal of producing meat, milk, and eggs is to drive efficiency and cost reduction. Feed is by far the largest input, so has one of the biggest opportunities for improvements and savings, and focusing on that economics, driving efficiency and cost reduction, you know, is part of a real value proposition that you can deliver to producers. So we talked about some of the reasons you should be interested in the animal feed space, but I also want to give you a few watch outs so you can go in eyes wide open. You know, it is a commodity B2B market, and cost is such a main driver in our market space that we almost can't say it enough. You need to think about the hard value versus the soft value you can bring. And the hard value will win out almost every time. And those are things like, you know, improving efficiency, for example, versus something like, you know, you're delivering a natural or green product, which is more of a soft value item. It's also hugely diverse. You know, I think I said, you know, it's a $3 billion market, but getting to a large chunk of that can be really difficult. Applications and needs are different across species and change by geography as well. And you really need to make sure you're talking with someone that understands those differences and can help you work through that, because doing a top-down analysis can be really misleading otherwise. And then it's just expensive to enter. You know, you need to find and prove out a value proposition and invest in the research, the regulatory, and the sales. And even then, there are a lot of alternatives for almost all products, so it can be a very competitive market. So finally here, I'll just talk briefly about planning your approach. First one there is linking to the value proposition. This is about, again, figuring out the economic impact you can have for producers and then proving that out and keep going back to it throughout the development stages. I think having that value proposition well defined, getting it even out to a segment of producers early on to make sure they're accepting of it, if you can prove it out, is an important piece. On research, each application is different, but being able to express a mode of action in the target species is important. And often that's about doing in vitro research. And then you need to prove it out with in vivo research. And that's usually several animal trials. And producers will still want to conduct their own research as a step in the sales process when you finally start to commercialize it. And then regulatory, I know Ms. Maripizzi will go into this in some detail a little bit later, but it's really an important step to plan for. And not just the US regulatory, but recognizing the species you want to target, the geographies you want to be in, and what resources it'll take to get into those markets. It can be really surprising that for certain ingredients, even certain algae ingredients, that the US is the easiest place in the world to do business. And for other ingredients, it might be one of the last places because of the time and resources it takes. So you just need to plan accordingly. And then costs. This again goes back to the value proposition in some ways, but knowing your cost limitations. So having a strong value proposition that can differentiate you and provide a lot of value to producers, but also understanding there are real limitations about how much cost a producer will add to his feed, almost no matter the proposed payoff. That's an important piece that we can't stress enough. There, because it's a commodity business, the cost limitations are real and really important to be aware of. So that's it for me. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ryan, for that valuable insight into animal feed market opportunities. Our next speaker today is Dr. Chet Wernes. He's the Director of Product Development at NutriQuest. Dr. Wernes holds a Master's of Science degree in Animal Science and a PhD in Animal Nutrition from Oklahoma State University. Dr. Wernes worked in the pet food industry at Quaker Oats and H.J. Heinz. He joined Cobb Van Tress, a subsidiary of Tyson Foods, in 1997 as Director of the World Feed Milling and Nutrition. He has traveled both domestically and internationally, presenting seminars to poultry companies on poultry broiler and breeder nutritional management. He joined NutriQuest in 2015 as Director of Poultry Technology and continues to develop new technologies for the poultry and other animal feed industries. Dr. Wernes will now educate us further into animal feed market opportunities and the value proposition.
Thank you, Valerie, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to cover an overview of the poultry industry, particularly the U.S. broiler industry. Broiler companies are structured in what we call a vertical integration system. The eggs from the breeder flocks are hatched in company-owned housing. The feed is made by the company's feed mills. The broilers that are hatched are actually sent off to contract growers, where those growers grow the birds up to market weights, and then the company owns their processing plants. This is a picture of a typical broiler house. As you can see, the birds are raised on what we call litter, which is primarily wood shavings, automatically fed. And you see those saucers in the picture. That's where the feed comes out and the birds eat from. And then the waters are on each side of that feed pan, and that's where they get their water. The house is generally controlled by an automated ventilation system. And the temperatures and humidity are kept optimal by these ventilation systems. This is the poultry U.S. feed volume. When we talk about poultry, We generally refer to three main species: the layer, which produces our table eggs, our broiler, which produces our chicken meat, and the turkey, which produces our turkey meat. For layers, around 16 million metric tons of feed is produced per year. For broilers, 64 million metric tons, and for turkeys, around 9 million metric tons. With these massive feed volumes, there's a great opportunity of getting feed additives and feed ingredients into the feed formulas. However, these poultry companies are very cost conscious. Typically, they look for a 3-to-1 return on their investment, or 3-to-1 return on the cost of your product. Typically, each broiler company will raise its birds in different areas of the country. These areas are called complexes, and as I mentioned before, each complex is vertically integrated. Complexes will consist of a breeder flocks, hatcheries, feed mill, broiler houses, and processing plants. On average, about 1 million birds per week are processed at these complexes. The company owns everything except for the broiler houses. These broiler houses are owned by independent growers, which the company has contracts with. Approximately 9 billion, with a B, broilers are produced per year here in the U.S. 64 million tons of feed is produced. A feed formula for broilers is typically made up of a corn, soybean-based diet. These are the two major ingredients that is in broiler feed. About 1.2 billion bushels of corn is used, and this equates to 11,000 square miles of corn being grown just for the broiler industry. Over 500 million bushels of soybean are also used by the industry. In the U.S., there are approximately 164 broiler complexes, about 25,000 broiler farms, and 355,000 workers are directly employed by the industry. There are approximately 35 broiler companies in the U.S. The table shows the top U.S. broiler companies. The largest broiler company is Tyson Foods. They produce about 38 million birds per week in 32 processing plants. Pilgrim's Pride produces 30 million birds per week in 24 plants. These top two companies produce 37% of the broiler chicken meat that's produced in the U.S. The top 5 companies produce 60% of the total chicken meat, and these top 10 companies produce 81%. From an industry standpoint, 56 billion pounds of chicken are produced per year. The average body weight of a broiler processed in the U.S. is 6.5 pounds. The average feed conversion ratio is 1.8. What this means is it takes 1.8 pounds of feed to produce 1 pound of live weight. The average age of a processed broiler is 46 days of age. Approximately 65 to 75% of the cost of broiler production is in the feed. Today, the average feed cost ton is $220. As I mentioned earlier, these broiler companies are very cost conscious. For every dollar increase in feed ton cost, it equates to $285,000 per complex. The low cost of chicken meat can be directly attributed to the genetic improvements that the broiler genetic companies have made, and to a lesser extent to the nutrition that we feed the broilers, as well as the way we manage the broilers during the grow-out process. Before I talk about the genetic improvements, since I'm a chicken nutritionist by training, I want to first say that no hormones or steroids are fed to broilers throughout the world. 2 primary reasons for this is that it's illegal and you can go to jail for trying to feed them, but also these types of compounds do not work to improve the efficiency or the growth rate in broilers. The table shows the genetic potential of broilers from 1990 to 2020. All these numbers are equalized to a 42-day of age. In 1990, a 42-day broiler would weigh 3.5 pounds. In 2020, a broiler weighs 6.5 pounds. The FCR in 1990 was 2.2, which just means it took 2.2 pounds of feed to produce 1 pound of live weight. In 2020, 1.6 FCR. Genetic improvements have also decreased broiler fat content, increased carcass yield, and increased breast meat yield. In the US, the white meat is by far the most desirable meat. Some key selection traits that the broiler genetic companies are making: they're selecting birds for better feed conversion, meat yield, growth rate, egg production, and hatchability. But they are also selecting for broiler welfare aspects, such as leg strength, livability, heart and lung health, and traits like those. This is a typical broiler body weight curve. The x-axis shows days of age, and then the y-axis in pounds. Typically, a broiler chick is hatched weighing 40 grams, which is 0.08 pounds. At 56 days of age, these birds have the potential to reach an 8.75 pound body weight. The way we feed broilers has dramatically changed in the last 5 or 6 years, and this is due to the increased demand of antibiotic-free. The definition of antibiotic-free really depends on the customer. Some customers do not let any antibiotics whatsoever be fed to the bird, while other customers only limit the use of antibiotics that are important to human medicine. An example of this would be ionophore. Ionophore is an antibiotic, but it is used to treat protozoa infections that chickens get. It is not important to human medicine because it's in its own class of antibiotics. One of the first major restaurants to come up with an antibiotic and welfare policy was Chick-fil-A. They first released their antibiotic stewardship program in 2014, announcing commitments to serve chickens raised with no antibiotics ever by December 31st, 2019. Utilizing the FDA definition with no distinction between medically and non-medically important antibiotics. This program does not allow for the use of ionophores and is verified by the USDA. Another example of antibiotic stewardship and welfare policy is by the Yum Group. Taco Bell committed to serve chicken raised without antibiotics important to human medicine in all U.S. restaurants by the end of Q1 2017. Pizza Hut committed to serve chicken raised without antibiotics important to human medicine by 2022. KFC, as of January 1st, 2019, all chicken purchased by KFC in the U.S. is raised without antibiotics important to human medicine. The third antibiotic stewardship policy that I'm going to share with you today is from McDonald's. McDonald's believe in the responsible use of antibiotics rather than the elimination and a tiered approach to reduction. In 2016, McDonald's reached commitment to serve broiler chicken not treated with antibiotics of human importance in all U.S. restaurants. In 2018, they began implementing this chicken broiler antibiotic policy globally. And by January 2027, McDonald's is planning to eliminate all antibiotics. This graph shows the move to no antibiotics ever programs. In 2014, less than 5% of the broilers raised were raised as NAE. Today, we are around 50% of the birds raised without antibiotics. So the move toward NAE has opened up some exciting opportunities for feed additives and alternative ingredients. Companies are looking for ways to reduce their cost of production and improve broiler efficiency. But whatever technology they decide on, it must have an acceptable return on their investment. This is a picture of our broiler trial facility where we conduct the majority of our research. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you, Dr. Warnes, for that in-depth look at the poultry industry and the thought-provoking look at the value proposition that algae can provide to animal feed manufacturers by helping them succeed in producing without antibiotics. Seems like there is quite an opportunity there, actually. Our next speaker is Martha Maripesi. Martha is a sought-out legal and policy advisor on matters where technological advancement, environmental protection, and governance intersect. Her clients are solving today's major environmental security issues, including climate change, PAFS, contamination, and ocean plastics. Martha frequently consults on chemical control under the Toxic Substances Control Act, as well as initiatives that advance bio-based sustainable products, such as algae-based products. Martha serves on the Environmental Law Institute's board of directors and was recognized as one of the nation's top energy and environmental trailblazers. Please enjoy Martha's in-depth look at the regulatory process for entry into animal feed markets in the US, the EU, and China.
I'm Martha Maripes, and I'm a partner with the law firm of Wiley Ryan in Washington, D.C. I am happy to be with you today as a presenter during the 2020 ABO Virtual Conference. We like to say at Wiley that no matter where a company's business is going, at some point, they'll most likely have to navigate DC to get to where they want to go. That is certainly the case with the topic that I've been asked to discuss with you today, which is U.S. animal feed requirements. But before we begin, I'd like to let ABO and our audience in on some exciting news. Wiley recently welcomed leading food and drug lawyers Ann Begley and Gary Yingling to the firm. Ann has agreed to chair our food and drug practice. We are absolutely delighted to be working with Ann and Gary, and I know many of you know them. Let's look at the overall legal framework in the next two slides. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, regulates animal feed, pet food, pet treats, and their ingredients. The agency's authority comes from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or FFDCA. Within FDA, the Center for Veterinary Medicine, or CVM, regulates animal feed products. The Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, or CFSAN, is responsible for the regulation of human food products. Animal feed is highly regulated at every stage at the federal and state level. Companies need to demonstrate safety for each animal that will consume the feed ingredient. We refer to these as the target animal. Also, my presentation today is limited to animal feed. There are separate regulatory requirements for new animal drugs and medicated animal feeds. Those products are outside the scope of my presentation today. In the animal feed arena, there is a very active state regulatory component. FDA cooperates with the Association of Animal Feed Control Officials, or AAFCO, and the states to implement uniform policies for regulating the use of animal feed. AAFCO is composed primarily of state regulatory officials who are responsible for the enforcement of state laws regulating the safe production and labeling of animal feed. Each year, AAFCO publishes its official publication of Uniform Feed Ingredient Definitions. AAFCO also has detailed labeling for animal feed, such as guaranteed analysis and nutritional adequacy statements. Many states have adopted AAFCO's model rules, which are intended to assure that animal feeds and ingredients are correctly and truthfully labeled when they enter commerce. FDA and AAFCO work together in the area of establishing definitions to describe new feed ingredients. Obtaining an AAFCO listing for a new ingredient takes about a year, and it includes the involvement of FDA personnel in the safety review. To summarize, FDA has responsibility for regulating the use of animal food products. The states also regulate in this area extensively, and AAFCO serves a strong advisory role. However, the ultimate responsibility for producing safe and effective animal feed and establishing the safety of these products lies with the manufacturers. So let's talk about that next. A key takeaway is that a regulatory clearance for animal feed raises unique challenges compared to the requirements established for human food additives. Some people think it's easier to get an animal feed ingredient cleared than it is to clear a human food ingredient. That's not always the case. Safety needs to be established for each target animal that may consume the feed, and the use of the target animal when it is part of the human food supply also needs to be considered. Let's look at the pathways to market. First of all, keep in mind that any substance that is reasonably expected to become a component of feed is a feed additive. Any feed additive that is intended to have a technical effect in the food is deemed unsafe by FDA unless it conforms to an existing food additive regulation or qualifies as generally recognized as safe, or GRAS, or qualifies for another exclusion from the definition of a food additive. Why what I just told you is important is if you have an additive that is not in good standing, it is deemed unsafe by FDA. And any food that contains an unsafe food additive is considered adulterated by FDA. There are defined regulatory pathways for establishing the safety of an animal feed ingredient. Unfortunately, none of them are fast. Probably the longest process is the feed additive petition process. This process takes several years, often 4 years or many more. It results in a regulatory listing for an existing food additive regulation that is available for any company to use, and it cannot be changed except by going through another rulemaking process. The second pathway is the GRAS pathway, either through a self-determination by recognized experts in the field, or the GRAS determination can be submitted to CVM for review. CVM's review is not considered a clearance per se, however. Companies receive a no further questions determination and a listing on CVM's webpage. A very critical element of the GRAS process is that the primary data that form the basis for the determination must be peer-reviewed and published. And establishing GRAS includes the need to rely on or actually conduct animal feeding studies. By comparison, the feed additive petition process does allow companies greater freedom to rely on unpublished data that is, of course, subject to FDA's review. But in the GRAS world, the data that form the basis for your GRAS determination must be peer-reviewed and published. If you do undertake to go through the CVM GRAS affirmation process, you need to be prepared for an extensive review. Companies may go through several rounds of questions and additional data development. The process can take on the order of 2 years or more. Right now, there are 2 microalgae oil submissions on the CVM GRAS website that were filed in January 2020 and which are still pending. GRAS Submission 36 and GRAS Submission 37 are for a microalgae oil from Schizochitrium as a source of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, DHA, and EPA in dog food and cat food, respectively. Note that the company has filed 2 separate filings for this ingredient. It's probably a good regulatory strategy because if there's a delay in one of the submissions, it may not result in a delay in the other. But also it underscores what I said earlier about the need to establish safety for each separate target animal that is going to be ingesting the feed additive. Microalgae companies also need to keep in mind that color additives are defined separately from food additives. And so as a result, color additives cannot be cleared through a GRAS process. I'll say that again, color additives are not eligible for GRAS determinations. This is important to know since some ingredients produced by microalgae impart color. For example, there's a color additive listing at 21 CFR section 73.37 for astaxanthin that contains beta-carotene. It's allowed for use in fish feed as a component of a stabilized mixture. This is a highly nuanced area. If your new animal feed ingredient imparts color and it is your intent to enhance color to an animal flesh or the food that it's producing, such as chicken or eggs, then you should evaluate the need to file a color additive petition. Finally, AAFCO listings are required in some states for use of the feed ingredient on top of having good regulatory status at the FDA level. And as I mentioned, the AAFCO listing process can take about. Facilities that produce animal feed ingredients need to meet certain minimum food safety and security standards. These facilities need to be registered with FDA. They need to assess hazards and have preventive controls in place for identified risks. They need to follow current good manufacturing practices or CGMPs for animal feed production. And they need to be prepared to report animal feed problems to FDA through dedicated electronic portals. The source of many of these requirements is the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. It was signed into law in 2011. FSMA established the Hazard Analysis and Risk-Based Preventive Control System, or HARPC. There are some exemptions from FSMA, HARPC, GMP requirements for certain food facilities, including certain farm operations. But these facilities must still be registered with FDA, and the rules need to be carefully reviewed to see if these exemptions apply. The focus of these requirements is on the prevention of food and feed-borne illness. FDA and the states have rules that must be followed when labeling animal feed products. Here, you need to keep in mind that labeling is defined very broadly. It's not just the label on the package. It includes other written materials and also information that's put out on the internet. Under many state regulations, there's a prescribed list of information that needs to be included. It includes the product and brand name, a quantity statement, purpose statement, the guaranteed analysis statement, a list of ingredients by common or usual name in descending order of predominance by weight, directions for use, warning and caution statements, and of course the name and address of the manufacturer. As I've previously noted, FDA recognizes the definitions as they appear in the official publication of AAFCO as the common or usual name for animal food ingredients, including pet food. CVM generally embraces the AAFCO and state labeling requirements. CVM also has guidance on making claims on labels. This guidance should be consulted to avoid misbranding claims for feed products that may cause the product to be regulated as a drug. On slide 9, you will see a number of references for the areas we've discussed. However, I want to take this opportunity to emphasize the importance of pre-submission consultations with FDA if you're preparing a feed additive petition or a submission for the GRAS affirmation process. It will save you time and effort to talk to the agency in advance and reach an understanding upfront about what data FDA expects in these submissions. Often, it seems difficult for companies to understand what data FDA will require to support these submissions. Earlier this year, FDA issued draft guidance on the voluntary pre-consultation process. Unfortunately, this guidance does not answer the question of what data you will need exactly, but it does give you a good appreciation of what FDA expects to see in study protocols for the studies to be found acceptable by the agency. When we were planning this session, we thought it would be helpful to provide the audience with some comparative information on other systems. In the EU, for example, the legislation on animal feed is harmonized. And by harmonized, I mean the rules are adopted at the EU level, the authorizations are granted at the EU level, but implementation and control of other aspects of the system takes place at the national level. In the EU, the European Food Safety Authority does a scientific review of the applications, and the additives are authorized by the European Commission based on EFSA's recommendations. Authorized additives appear on a positive list that's called the EU Register of Feed Additives. And overall, it's a comparatively well-defined process, but there are fewer options in the EU for establishing regulatory clearance compared to the US. In the EU, the authorization that you receive is dependent upon the type of additive that you have. In general, authorizations are valid for 10 years. They can be renewed for 10-year periods. The system overall has general requirements for hygiene, for hazard analysis and control points, for labeling, feed additives, and for good manufacturing practices and the like. The feed sector is affected by Brexit, and changes are expected when the transition period ends later this year in December 2020. At least on paper, the EU EFSA review is designed to take 6 months. There and in China, companies need to be prepared for things to take longer, as questions and logistical issues will invariably arise. Let's look at China. China has a positive list system. It includes directories for approved feed and feed additives, as well as a list of approved countries and product categories for imports. If your product is coming from somewhere else, you're out of luck. Currently, the US is on the approved country list. There are several layers of regulation to be aware of. The Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, or MOA, clears new feed ingredients. There are also important customs clearance requirements that are administered by the GACC. The entire system, including the positive lists, was updated in 2018. Under the new system, pet food is now separately regulated from other types of feed products. When the law was changed, agencies were consolidated as well, but some of the new regulations have similar names. For example, the former AQSIQ agency functions for customs have been consolidated with the GACC. However, the new regulations in this area are referred to as the General Administration of Quality Supervision, Inspection, and Quarantine. You guessed it, AQSIQ. Two of the key requirements for foreign manufacturers to keep in mind are the need to obtain an enterprise registration and an import registration certificate. Let's quickly look at the requirements for an import registration certificate. First, you need to appoint an agent to represent you during this process. Your pre-market application needs to be submitted to MOA, and it has to include items such as the required labeling, quality standards information, your production method, and testing. In about 10 days' time, you'll be notified to send samples for verification, and again, there may be other testing required for new additives. The verification testing is completed within about 3 months, and your license is issued within 10 days afterwards. It sounds simple, right? Keep in mind, this is a complex system with many layers that does require agents on the ground to navigate, and things could take longer. Here's my contact information if you'd like to have a conversation about the material that we've covered today. This is also a forwardable offer. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions at the conclusion of our session.
Thank you, Martha, for that in-depth look into U.S. regulations, as well as summaries of both the EU and China regulations for animal feed additives. I want to remind all the attendees that you can ask questions for our panelists in the Q&A area at any time during this session. Our fourth speaker today is Andrew Dahl. He is the CEO of Zevo Bioscience, an algae company positioning to enter animal feed markets with a proprietary algae product from a new and exciting algal strain. Andrew's educational background includes a degree in advertising from Wayne State University. He was the president of Dauber & Company, Inc. for 25 years, and for the last 15 years has been a managing partner for Great Northern and Reserve Partners. Andrew has positioned Zevo Bioscience well for success as Zevo moves to produce biomass at multiple facilities around the globe. Please join me in viewing Andrew's presentation, Commercializing Microalgae for Animal Health and Nutrition Application Feed Ingredients for Poultry, Swine, and Cattle.
Thanks for joining this seminar. I'm Andrew Dahl, Zevo Bioscience CEO. My primary role is to ensure that Zevo transitions from a pre-revenue R&D company into a revenue-generating producer and aggregator of algal bio. Millions of people consume millions of tons of animal products. The system is operating at full capacity, and animal feed production remains flat as another billion people are expected to inhabit the planet in a few short years. We need to get more animal biomass out of the plant biomass used for feed. This sets up an opportunity for algae-based feed ingredients, but it's no small undertaking. For example, U.S. poultry producers purchase 34 million tons of poultry feed each year. Every ton of feed contains small amounts of medications and chemicals, along with prebiotic and probiotic products added to the corn and soy feed mix. Competition for that 200 to 500 gram slot of specialty ingredients is fierce, the margins are thin, and capital costs can be enormous. And producers aren't shy about pushing down the retail price on these specialty ingredients if they don't deliver on their promise. If you're contemplating entering this market, consider putting a check next to each of these boxes before you approach investors, foundations, or governmental agencies, and certainly before you develop engineering specs. Doing so will improve your odds of staying in business and with a reasonable shot of profitability. The product itself is the obvious starting point. Is there a claim of efficacy or biological activity, or are you merely relying on the nutritional profile? What animal species are you targeting, and for what specific purpose? Is it disease-related, productivity-related, something else? Do you have repeatable data sets to support your claims? Have you vetted your strain to make sure it can be approved in one or more regulatory classes? And probably the most important checklist item is ownership. Is it a proprietary strain? Have you filed a patent? Or are you growing a garden variety algae that anyone can grow, leaving yourself vulnerable to low-cost countries that can undercut your offering? Producing algal biomass and selling it for more than the cost to grow is its own challenge, and that means getting very granular with all the cultivation details and their related costs. What drives these production costs are, in fact, the CGM protocol and the product specification that correlate to the approved use. In other words, you're constellating your production processes and costs around the approved product specification of the finished product, even if it's just dried biomass in a bag. The algae industry talks about TEAs and using TEAs to refine production costs, but just how well developed that TEA is will have a huge impact on the scenario modeling that you'll need to do. Now, growing product for non-existent market or one crowded with direct competitors or functional equivalents is all too common. In fact, your strain selection should be guided by market opportunities and validated demand. And if not for your specific algae, then for a market entry that solves a very specific need for which your algae may be well suited. If absolutely no one is buying any product to solve a certain problem, it's usually not because a product isn't available, but it's more likely a problem that no one needs to solve because it's not affecting their bottom line. So get an understanding of go-to-market strategies and specifically the industry that you're targeting. Animal health and husbandry is highly specialized, segmented, and numbers driven. Expect to be handing out lots of sample product, as in tons of sample product. Expect to be fronting the costs of demonstration pilots and field trials for which no sales contracts may materialize. So when you start putting that business plan together, think about all the costs and commitments, beginning with the sunk costs in R&D that may need to be repaid, recouped, or capitalized. Capital expenditures for land, equipment, software, and so on can be funded with risk capital or debt or both. Operating expenses should have a startup allocation that provides the enterprise with a runway of a few months or maybe even a year to get up to where there's cash flow from operations. And then the variable costs that are typically tied to production volume. So the cost of goods sold generally moves up and down with production, processing, but not always. And then, of course, operating costs or overhead, such as salaries and benefits, have to be added to this. And then there's the money itself, which costs money, whether it's invested capital or a loan. It needs to be returned as principal and interest or as return on investment. Once you have costs of good in hand, the amount of funding required to achieve break even or better, including the cost of money and so on, you're now at the point to begin modeling a variety of scenarios to address what's referred to as jumping the chasm. That transition point where you've used up the startup capital and debt and must now rely solely on cash from ongoing operations. This is where most startups stall and crash regardless of industry, but particularly in agriculture, because very, very few ag-based businesses require as much capital expense or have higher operating expenses. So there's not a lot of room for error. Setting up a solid model for scenario management will provide the insights needed to carefully manage your resources, whether it's personnel or grow media, and get to positive cash flow in the shortest time possible. The more detailed the model, the more accurate and revealing its projected outcomes. I strongly suggest that a variety of scenarios are played out before the startup begins, and not just the usual high, low, medium revenue scenarios. More importantly, the model must adjust overhead, cultivation, and processing costs to accommodate the monthly burn pre-revenue or the available cash flow once fully operational. And you'll likely find that keeping your capex to a bare minimum and designing your facility to squeeze down operating costs is very, very important. And that likely means folding chairs and tables in the office, or more likely, no office at all, and rented lab hours at a local college or ag cooperative. Most of you are familiar with a typical income statement that projects out revenues and expenses over some number of years. What it doesn't show are chronic cash shortages, buy downs, missed property tax payments, liens, and stiff interest rates to finance receivables that are past due. So your typical accounting balance sheets and income statements don't even begin to address the realities of day-to-day operations. Cash flow and margin analyses are some of the tools needed to figure out where the vulnerabilities are in your business assumptions. Are you expecting customers to be slow payers? Have you kept money or a credit line in reserve? Your cash shortages may occur immediately after the startup capital primary loan or grant is depleted, or it could show up 2 years later as operational costs increase with production volume, but somehow the model doesn't hold together. Money, whether borrowed or invested, has a cost that increases over time. Any delay in payment from customers, deployment of revenue generating equipment at your facility, a crash, labor problems, inclement weather can cause a situation shown here, where the income just cannot catch up with the cost of money over time. This is a very necessary part of modeling the enterprise because it impacts the most important number in this entire equation, your sell price, or more precisely, your value proposition. This is where the research, the engineering, the capital funding, the operational efficiencies in your efforts meet with reality. The green indicates the fixed price that a producer will pay for your product based on its demonstrated economic benefit. So for an example, $3. The red represents the all-in cost of your product, including shipping and tax to that producer. If your all-in cost, including interest, is less than $1, you stand to make a substantial profit. On the other hand, if your costs, your total costs, exceed even by a few cents what the producer is willing to pay, you'll be out of business, looking for other market verticals, or looking back at all your assumptions so that you can re-engineer your production model, maybe even switch algal strains. Now, by taking this approach, you can likely squeeze out or avoid a substantial number of the risks and perils associated with this endeavor, whether it's a startup or an ongoing biomass operations. Animal health and nutrition is not an isolated case. Much of this applies to any industry sector where microalgae may be a viable food or feed ingredient. Thanks for joining this seminar.
Unmute, please.
Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you, Andrew, for the insightful presentation on how companies in our industry sector need to approach animal feed markets to position for success. I just want to remind everybody that our Q&A will begin after our next presentation, and to please submit your questions to the Zoom Q&A feature. Our final speaker today is William Fund, Vice President of Research and Development at Zevo Bioscience. William has a BS in biology from the State University of New York, College of Oswego, and an MS in microbiology with emphasis on mammalian cell culture from the Ohio State University. His career includes nearly 20 years in big pharma, including Pfizer, where he was responsible for analytical support at all stages of the drug discovery and development continuum, from early candidate identification through marketed product support. After leaving Pfizer, William held director-level positions at multiple analytical contract laboratories, including Eurofins and Covance. Now, as VP of Research and Development for Zevo Bioscience, he is responsible for establishing the company's R&D strategy, as well as establishing and maintaining relationships with the numerous collaborators and contractors that that assists Zevo in discovering and developing novel nutritional and therapeutic applications for the proprietary algal-based materials. Please join me in focusing on William's presentation, Scientific Support of Microalgae Commercialization. There's no such thing as too much data.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Valerie, and thank you also for the invitation to participate in today's panel. You know, I consider myself a bit of an algae outsider. I do have a fairly long career in the pharmaceutical and food industries supporting product commercialization primarily from an analytical perspective, but I've only been involved with algae for about 2.5 years. So my hope today is that my participation here will shed a little bit of a different light on what it takes to support microalgae product commercialization from an analytical perspective, and that what I have to offer will help facilitate the efforts of others to develop products based on their proprietary microalgae strains. Now, before I jump into the meat of my presentation, let me acknowledge that there are multiple paths for algal feed product development. Obviously, the simplest path is one where whole algal biomass is incorporated as a feed ingredient. And at Zevo, we refer to this as the AgTech pathway. Alternatively, a specific active compound or compounds could be purified for use as a feed additive. This pathway we refer to as the biotech pathway, and it's much more complex and involves a much more arduous regulatory pathway. So for the sake of this presentation, I'll just be focusing on supporting product development along the AgTech pathway. As we've already heard from Ryan, Chet, and Andrew, the demand and the market potential for effective algal-based feed ingredients is really massive. But market entry is not exactly a slam dunk. While the list of naturally derived ingredients is growing dramatically, many of the new products have not performed as promised, and unfortunately, these broken promises adversely affect the perception of all new products. So if we add to this the issue of shrinking profit margins for producers, which means that every herd and every flock must produce maximum yield, we now have an environment where the producers have very low risk tolerance, so our value proposition must be very clear from the get-go. So how does one provide assurance of success and value? I can sum up the answer to that in one word, and that word is data. With that as the backdrop, here are the 4 topics I'd like to discuss today. Number 1, credible efficacy testing. And here we'll talk about how to put together a bulletproof body of work to convince the end user that you have a consistently performing product that provides benefit. We'll then shift attention to determining mechanism of action, and we'll discuss why this is important, even though there's no explicit regulatory requirement to do so. We'll then briefly touch on compliance testing, and finally, what activities can we do internally to refine and optimize the product? Okay, let's talk about expectations for demonstrating that a product actually works. Right up front, I'm going to say something that might make a few people nervous, but that is, you absolutely must compare the performance of your product to an industry gold standard, that is, the best product that's currently on the market with which you will be competing once your product enters the market. And you have to do this because it's exactly the first thing that your customers will do. And if it makes you nervous, I'm sorry to say it, but you probably don't have a competitive product. For the reasons that I've mentioned earlier, our end users are looking for definitive results from quality studies and lots of them. The number of studies will depend on product that you're bringing forward, the magnitude of its effect, etc. So it's really impossible for me to give a recommendation as to the minimum number of studies. But for reference, I can tell you that Zevo has performed approximately 20 studies for one of its lead AgTech products. And regardless of the number of studies that are performed, they should be run at well-regarded study locations, and multiple locations at that. For the 20 studies that Zevo's performed for its lead ag tech candidate, we've run these at 4 different locations, and we've mixed in both academic and commercial study locations. Your studies and the study designs should be vetted by industry-leading consultants to make sure that you've got all the variables and all the bases covered. And we should talk about study size, but this is somewhat of a difficult topic because we all know that animal studies are notoriously variable. Results may vary between studies, within a study, and they're especially variable when studies are run out in the field where strict control of every variable is difficult. As a result of this, reaching statistical significance in your results may be difficult depending on the magnitude of the effect being demonstrated. But the good news is that's okay, as long as you can provide data that shows consistent practical significance across the studies. Remember that small, statistically insignificant effects, when multiplied over large animal numbers, may very well result in financially significant effects. So in other words, consistent economic benefit is the most important thing to be showing in your studies. And finally, you'll want to test multiple lots or batches to prove that you have consistent performance. As you design and carry out your numerous studies, you'll want to be certain that they mimic the production environment as much as possible. That means if you're targeting a disease-related effect, for example, you should perform the disease challenge in different ways. You might challenge at different stages of development, or perhaps use different strains of the pathogen, for example. How you house the animals will be critically important as well. Replicate the type of enclosures that will be used in the production environment, and be certain to replicate the density of animals in each cage or pen that will be seen at production facilities, because animals experience different stresses depending on the housing density, and this variable alone can significantly confound interpretation of results, and in some cases perhaps even mislead you with regards to the commercial viability of a product. Similarly, you must test the feed form that will be used in the production environment. For example, if the commercial producers will be using pelletized feed, you should run your product through the pelletizing process to be sure that it can withstand the temperatures and pressures involved. Or if you intend to use a spray-on process, spraying onto mash versus pelletized feed could produce very different results due to the drastically different surface areas involved. And also be sure to test your product in complete feed formulations that include all the typical feed additives common to the industry. For example, include all the enzymes, minerals, etc. that would be expected at the various facilities to be certain that there are no unanticipated adverse interactions that might compromise product performance or the health of the animal. All of your studies should involve numerous analytical endpoints to provide a comprehensive view of the benefits of your product. So the endpoints will vary, but in most cases, there's likely to be animal performance endpoints like feed conversion ratio and the related parameters, and also measures of product yield, carcass weight, meat yield, etc. If your product is aimed at mitigating the effect of disease, then there will be a series of disease endpoints that should be measured, such as mortality, presence and replication potential of the pathogen, for example, and perhaps some physical effects such as lesion scoring and so on. You should also seriously consider including some product endpoints, meat quality, color, fat content, that sort of thing, so that you know how your product is affecting the producer's end product. And then undoubtedly there'll be a series of product specific measurements, that is, measurements specific to your product that you'll want to include. And it's impossible for me to predict what those might be, but certainly they should be listed here. In the end, you want all of this data to speak for itself. If you need to parse it or explain it in any way, then it's likely that the effect is not strong enough to convince producers to take a chance on your product. Often, I think not enough attention is given to understanding how new natural products work. But I think it's really important, even though it may not be explicitly required for regulatory approval or market entry. And I say this for a couple of reasons. First, it completes your story. And this is a little bit of a marketing thing, but the credible efficacy testing that we just discussed is fine. But savvy producers, and they're all savvy, by the way, they want to know how a product works in order to gain the comfort that they need to take a chance on it. Again, remember the aversion to risk that we spoke about a little bit ago. Secondly, in order to characterize potential product limitations, you have to understand how it works. Does your product work directly on a pathogen? If so, then you might have resistance issues. What other limitations might it have? Well, how are you going to know if you don't understand how it works? And also identifying the specific compound or compounds that are the active compounds will be helpful in a number of areas. For example, you'll want to know this if you're going to undertake algal strain and process optimization. It's also helpful to know this to design appropriate stability studies for compliance purposes. And for some routes of product approval, such as USDA immune product registration, potency assays and identity tests are required, and knowing the active compound would be extremely helpful in those situations. How you go about determining the MOA for your specific product will certainly be unique, but in most cases, one should seek out in vitro methods that model the specific disease or condition being treated by the product, and then confirm the MOA using in vivo studies and a range of analytical endpoints, such as histology, blood chemistry, and molecular profiling. Regardless of the nature of the product and the regulatory path chosen, there are going to be numerous areas where data is going to be needed to gain regulatory approval. These will include compositional profiling. This is required for all regulatory paths, and you'll need to test multiple batches, usually up to 5, to demonstrate process consistency. Safety studies will obviously be needed, but the specific design, the dose, duration, tissues to be examined, etc., will vary from product to product and also vary with respect to the intended application. As previously mentioned, stability studies will be required. These will be linked to the intended use and the active molecules. And finally, there'll be a need for ongoing quality testing, product release testing, essentially for the life of the product. Lastly, this slide shows some examples of where data will be needed for internal purposes, but I won't go through it in detail because I'm out of time and actually gone a little bit long. So I will just leave you with this here. And Valerie, thank you again for the opportunity to participate in this panel.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that presentation. It's very nice to get a realistic view of the data necessary to move algae products into animal feed markets. We're now going to move into our live Q&A with our panelists, and we look forward to a lively discussion with our attendees and panelists on this important market segment for algae products. You can continue to submit questions during the Q&A feature while we're actually executing the Q&A process. So our first question today is actually directed to all of the panelists. If an animal feed is already veterinary standardized, which is also cheaper, I'm not sure I quite understand that question. I'll go to the second one here. If a company markets animal feed, it might get tagged as an animal feed industry, as marketing to the animal feed industry. What problems are anticipated once the company diversifies into human consumption? And what strategies would you suggest to avert such labeling?
I can take a shot at that just to start with. I think, as we think about algae and animal feed, from a NutriQuest standpoint, we tend to look at the opportunities not so much as a commodity ingredient, and we look at it more as how it can perform as a value-added feed ingredient. So if the question is directed more towards like raising funds and making sure you're kind of in a space where you can effectively raise funds, when you're in that value-added feed ingredient bucket, you're more in that egg tech space. And if you're in the egg tech bucket, then you're often in the agri-food tech bucket, which gives you a lot more ability to raise funds. On the flip side of that, if the question is more towards regulatory, and Andrew and Ms. Maripizzi can weigh in here and their experiences there, you have some of the same regulatory hoops to jump through. So there's some overlap there and some synergies when you're addressing regulatory for both food for humans and food for animals.
Yeah, and I would add, there's going to be testing requirements in order to be in one market versus the other that might be different, and Bill can probably tell us a little bit more about that. But I agree with you on the regulatory side, the very different regulatory pathways, and it depends on what the human food application is going to be. It's going to be a dietary supplement. Is it going to be an actual ingredient that is added to food? Is it going to be put into something that's regulated as a cosmetic? So there are regulatory hoops no matter what, and there are also labeling and marking considerations that you need to take into account, again, to stay on the line of a food versus making drug claims, having an effect in or on humans.
Great. Thank you both very much. This next question is also for you, Martha. If any of the other panelists want to take a stab or any comments on this as well, please do after Martha answers. What are the pros and cons of self-affirmed GRAS versus CBM GRAS certification? Is there a regulatory path to ingredient approval that is more common or standard practice in the animal feed industry?
Well, the CBM GRAS affirmation process takes a long time, and it's iterative. It's an iterative process, and so many companies have established GRAS through the self-affirmation process by doing the studies, by having, for example, a panel of 3 experts review the studies and provide expert opinions, and establishing a GRAS affirmed position on their own. And generally speaking, brand manufacturers will accept that position for many ingredients. But I think, Bill's presentation was really excellent and underscores the need for really good studies if you're going to take that approach.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else have any comments on that question?
Bill, you need to unmute. I did the same thing.
Muted, I saw that, sorry.
Yep.
I was just going to add that it may be, as I said in my presentation, some of these things are somewhat marketing related, but the having the no objection or no question notice from the FDA can be leveraged for marketing purposes in a way. I mean, the data may not be any different for going through the CBM GRAS route as it is for the self-affirmed, but it just gives people a little bit more of a warm, fuzzy feeling knowing that the FDA actually looked at it and didn't have any questions.
Yeah, that's true. And I've also seen some companies go through the self-affirmed process themselves, but then go through the AFCO process. And because FDA is involved with that, that also provides, some level of assurance that the FDA has looked at an ingredient. But, it's not an FDA recognized pathway, of course, and it is nice to have the FDA review if you're trying to market the product. Just need to be, you need to be persistent and patient.
Yeah, our experience with the self-affirmed is that the downside is it may not be accepted by everyone everywhere. Certainly if it creates any perception of liability with integrated customers, that can be a huge risk as you enter the market. And even some states, if it doesn't show up in the AFCO official publication, they don't have the manpower or the resources to review your self-affirmation themselves. So they're either just slow to move or hard to get to move at all, or just reluctant to take a position, which can just slow you down in the long run. So there's some downsides to it. It is the much quicker way though, right? So it's often the preferred way.
Well, thank you all very much. This next question I want to direct first to Andrew and then open to the panel. But given vertical integration within the market, the importance of regulatory oversight, and issues of scale, what do you see as the most important tool to overcome the barriers to entry? Academic partnerships, capital, a good team? It seems that possibly only large existing firms will be able to overcome some of these hurdles.
Muted, Andrew.
Yeah, Andrew, you need to unmute. Yeah.
I think that the single most important thing that you can do is to partner with, establish the strategic partnerships, align yourself with industry thought leaders and innovators, and approach it from a cooperative, team-based approach, without a doubt. Because if you're an algae producer, there's much to learn about the industry as a whole, and involving yourself with innovators, you are that much further ahead.
I think the only other thing I would add from just a regulatory perspective again is really do your homework. We've mentioned during the presentations that some types of applications have a shorter time to market than others. So you certainly don't want your first application to be the one that takes the longest or the most data, because then, yeah, it's going to be a barrier to entry. But, understanding the market and what might allow you to get onto the market quicker while you're developing other applications as you go along is also a good lesson learned.
Yeah, and I tried to hit on this some in my presentation too. So, from a usefulness perspective, certainly the data and demonstrating that it works, that it actually works, and that there's a good value proposition there. Because, and Chet and I have talked about this from time to time, that the industries, the ag tech industries, the producers are clamoring for something new, a new alternative, but at the same time they're really risk averse. And so I think that's a major hurdle, to be able to address both of those at the same time, just to get them even to talk to you. And I think if you're a small company, if you partner properly, as Andrew mentioned, but you've got something that's really exciting, really strong data that shows that it works, there's a hunger for it out there.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Our next question is also for everybody to comment on if they'd like to. Given the current pandemic and public perception of the association between zoonotic diseases and concentrated animal feeding operations, aka factory farming, and the potentially disruptive alternative protein market demand, what are the long-term trends for animal feed demand, and by extrapolation, the demand for algae as a feed or a feed additive?
I'll maybe start here and others can add in. I think, if we look at COVID and the long-term protein demand pre-COVID, that demand was certainly increasing, driven largely by the middle class and more and more people going into the middle class. Are there guesses to how COVID is going to affect that? Not really at this stage, right? There's a lot that's unknown, and COVID could have a material shift there. But I think today most people are saying, that demand for protein over time is going to continue. I think one thing that has been really highlighted through COVID is the need for a safe, secure, high quality food supply. for sure. I mean, many U.S. customers for the first time in their lifetime went to a grocery store and couldn't find what they intended to find. So I think that'll definitely get some longer term attention. My guess is that'll probably drive, flexibility and redundancy in supply chains, and that's where you'll see that. If you look at the feed industry by itself, and look at compound annual growth rates, for example, those are in the single digits, right? That can vary by geography and species, and there's some brighter places. So what's the driver for demand for algae within that? Again, we tend not to think about it as on the commodity side for feed, but more the value-added nutrients. And Bill said it, right? People are hungry for innovation. So if algae can bring innovation in terms of feed additives and improve production, there's a real need and demand for that.
Yeah, great. This one is somewhat related, actually. So algal proteins have shown to exhibit lower digestibility as compared to soy. Is there a true opportunity for protein in animal feeds, given that?
Yes, there is, but it'll really come back to the cost. I mean, you don't, broiler companies do not feed the most digestible protein ingredients because many times those ingredients are very expensive. So they're not always going for true digestibility or the highest lysine levels or whatever type of nutrient you're talking about. So even if you have a product that has less protein digestibility than soybean meal, and really, we talked about the gold standard. Bill talked about the gold standard. And in poultry production, soybean meal is the primary protein source. But there's also a lot of other protein sources that companies use because of the cost implications. So just because you don't have the same digestibility as soybean meal doesn't mean that it's going to prevent a company from using it. It all comes back to the economics of that whole scenario.
Do you think the aspect of algae as being more sustainable or more sustainably produced holds any weight in animal feed markets at this point?
I think it's more of a soft type of target approach to take. I think all the panelists said it very well. Companies are looking for low cost alternatives, and when we talk about from a protein source, and that's a good story to have, but it will not command a great deal of value to particular companies at this time.
Valerie, that might help more with investment than with marketing. I think investors are interested in the sustainability and the environmental impact more than the producers. As Chet said, it's dollars and cents, and really mostly even just cents for them, but cents times the millions of animals that Chet talked about really adds up to dollars pretty quickly.
Yeah. Awesome. So our next question is directed to the entire panel, and we can take turns answering it. Have any studies indicated the need for co-location of algae production and animal production facilities, or are transportation costs minimal enough to allow fairly long distance transport of dried algae to feed production factories?
I don't think that's a serious consideration, given that algae will likely remain a fairly small component and will likely be a specialty ingredient. I don't think co-location, dried algal biomass is fairly light compared to some of the other feed ingredients. So I don't think that shipping costs or co-location is going to factor in very heavily.
I would tend to agree with that. Also, dried algal biomass that's packaged appropriately can have a pretty long shelf life, and is easy to transport when packaged appropriately as well. So I think the ability to move dried algal biomass around the world actually to markets is fairly straightforward and can be easily done well. Yeah. So this next one is directed to Andrew and Bill and then to the entire panel. Does the panel have any suggestions on which type of algae to focus on for animal feed applications? Is there a desired biochemical composition to aim for that would set algae apart from established feed additives?
I guess the best way to look at that is what poultry producers are looking for. You know, they're looking to create healthier birds. They're looking for increased productivity. They're looking to decrease the feed conversion ratio. So any algal strain, of which there are 72,000, that can provide those kind of benefits are the ones that need to be researched, optimized, and developed for production. We have ours, which is a proprietary strain, but the next step is to essentially start looking for strains that actually provide some nutritional benefit beyond just protein, and those are the ones that need to be developed further.
And the difficulty of doing that, of course, is there's no simple screening test for poultry production efficiency, you know, in vitro that uses just a small amount of algae. So if you're gonna look for benefit, and I think Andrew's right on, the trouble is if you want to even look at, let's just say we want to look at 10 different algae strains to see which ones may have benefits in poultry production for growth efficiency, et cetera. You need to do a study that's going to involve, you know, several hundreds, thousands of birds or whatever. You're going to need pounds of this stuff to mix with the feed in order to test that, and which means you've got to actually jump through the hoops of cultivating it in an efficient manner in order to get enough just to test it to know whether it makes sense to cultivate it. So it's difficult in that regard.
It's no small task.
Yeah, I would just add, there's certainly advantages to starting with natural strains versus GMO manipulated strains, GE strains, in terms of relative ease and acceptability in the market. Also looking at, you know, strains that have quite a bit of data already published on them, you know, may also provide a greater level of assurance than starting with new proprietary strains that nobody has ever seen before. And then, you know, some of the big added value areas that Andrew mentioned that we're seeing are high omega-3 content, the EPA, DHA, and PUFA area to be able to, you know, find strains that can provide those kinds of added benefits.
Yeah, I think maybe the way to do it is it's not going to be a shotgun screening different strains. It's going to be more understanding the nutritional requirements of the animals, the target species, and then looking for algae that provides something of consequence, you know, that the animals need, maybe in a higher percentage than soy does. So soy is a great protein source, but maybe it's not a great source of, you know, the oils that Martha mentioned or something else.
Yeah, I've also seen algae companies take the approach of trying to find a replacement for a product that already exists. So antibiotics are kind of an example of that, but there are certain natural compounds that feed manufacturers source from organisms that aren't algae, and oftentimes algae can produce those same compounds maybe more efficiently, maybe even a little bit of a different chemical structure that would have some value to the end user. Beta-glucan is a good example of that, where feed manufacturers were currently using it in the market. But there has been an algae that's been found that can be produced economically viably and produces a slightly different chemical structure of beta-glucan, and that's actually being actively marketed now as kind of an improved replacement product for something that already existed. And I think algae holds some potential in that area as well.
And Valerie, that gives me a quick moment to go back to the color additive issue that I mentioned in my presentation, because some people may be looking at algae as a replacement, for color. The color additive process is actually probably the longest process. I think I said it was the food additive petition process, but an FDA review of a color additive takes many, many years and involves, of course, extensive feeding studies. So while that might be a replacement, it wouldn't certainly be, the first place you'd want to dive off into the market if you wanted to get there soon.
Yeah, there's also another question actually that relates to the color additive use. Let me see. It's basically if your algae product will impart color, but you're not marketing it as a color additive. In other words, you don't intend for it to change the pigmentation, but it does. Are you still required to register that algae product as a color additive, even though you're not marketing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's why I said in my presentation, this is a nuanced area. And, certainly, I mean, it's a case-by-case determination. So if somebody has that issue, they should really talk to an expert to evaluate whether or not they need to go the color additive route or whether they can avoid it.
Okay, great. Our next question goes back to the digestibility issue. Is there such components originally in typical algae species that has a negative impact in digestibility in general?
Yeah, maybe not specifically on digestibility, but some algae products have high mineral contents. So if you start to get the inclusion levels high enough, it may cause a imbalance of mineral in a bird, causing diarrhea, flushing, and things like that. I'm not aware of any nutritional components of algae to depress digestibility.
Okay. This next question is.
Hey, Valerie,
Yes.
Something came to mind there to just, put out as a red flag for people that FDA looks at technologies that are introducing EPA and DHA oil into the market very carefully, because there is a certain ratio that's important in that regard. And it can cause a safety concern if that ratio is out of whack. And so I would flag that for some people, because some people think that producing more of anything is good, but not necessarily in the nutrition area, right?
Yeah, good point, actually. The next question is for the entire panel. It's animal feed is veterinary standardized and cheaper. How does algal feed, which is more expensive, weigh? Part of it's disappearing off the screen here. Give me a minute. Why would people shift? Where's the rest of this question? Why would people shift to an algal feed ingredient if other ingredients are cheaper?
Yeah, I think it goes back to looking for applications that are not the commodity type applications where you have to be the lowest cost, and you're bringing some other value, whether it's the prebiotics that were discussed or phytonutrients or some value add there that you can create a value proposition that makes sense to change to. If you're competing against commodity soy, as Chet kind of pointed out, it's a possibility, but it's much harder to find a spot there.
Yeah. What is the market scenario of the addition of algae in fish and shellfish feed as a dry ingredient? I could take a little stab at that. Shellfish are generally not being fed dry ingredients. However, there is a market in shellfish hatcheries for liquid algae ingredients. There's definitely some algae products being added into fish feeds at this point, but I believe most of them are oils like Martha was talking about earlier with the DHA and EPA.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of, I've been approached and worked with companies quite a bit on fish applications of algae, but not so much shellfish.
Yeah, I also was selling an algae ingredient that was registered as a color additive for salmon markets. A product produced from Hematococcus algae that has the astaxanthin in the biomass, which imparts the red color to the salmon flesh. That was an interesting product to sell. We definitely had our efficacy data. We were registered with the FDA with the color additive position, which, as Martha has said repeatedly, is difficult registration to get. I found that building credibility for that product with salmon producers was a little bit challenging. It took over 2 years to land any kind of significant product deal. It took a lot of supplying actual product to the feed manufacturers so that they could do their own internal testing. So they didn't just want to see our data. They wanted a lot of product from us to do their own testing and their own validation prior to making any sort of sales agreements with us. So it was taking on average about 2 years to build a solid relationship with a good customer in at least the salmon markets for color additives. We did have competition on price from synthetic color additives, but we found a successful market niche by looking at people who were producing salmon organically and were looking for natural pigments. Yeah, so the next question here is for Martha and then to everybody. With regards to regulatory approval of an algae strain as a feed ingredient, does the type of production, outdoor pond cultivation versus heterotrophic production versus photobioreactor, need to be defined for the approval and use in feed?
You know, it needs to be described in your application, but what FDA is looking at, what you should be looking at if you're, you know, establishing your own safety position is the safety of the feed itself. Certainly the way it's produced, you know, may materially affect impurities and you know, the end product. But I think what that question is getting at is that FDA doesn't necessarily regulate the process through this process. Certainly there's FSMA and all kinds of, you know, facility GMP requirements you need to bear in mind, but in the product regulatory approval process, the focus is on the feed ingredient.
Yeah, the other part of that question, which I think you kind of touched on, is, but in addition to the technology used for production, do you think that location of production has any effect on the regulatory process? For example, if the algae strain is the same, but it's grown outdoors in, say, the mainland US versus Hawaii, would that have any impact on its ability to be approved?
I mean, no, that's not the consideration of where. I mean, you know, as we've been talking, a couple of these questions have come up where if you are growing algae, you know, outside of a bioreactor, there's certainly locational and seasonal considerations that come into play there, right? So, you know, where you grow algae is somewhat dictated by the conditions under which they can grow. But no, it affects, you know, your regulatory position with respect to what that process is contributing to the final product. But where you do it, if you do it overseas, in Hawaii, on the mainland, is not a primary concern of FDA's for the approval process. Again, wherever you produce a food ingredient, though, FDA requirements for food safety and prevention of foodborne illness are going to apply to your facility. The CGMPs, the FSMA requirements, with exemptions. There are exemptions for certain facilities, but you need to keep in mind that that's where the facility issues lie.
Yeah, so another question that kind of goes along with that. What role does the fact that algae are grown on wastewater have in legislative terms?
Well, all of that would need to be disclosed. I don't really know about that technology, so I don't really have too much more to say about it. But all that information about how an algae would be grown is important and needs to be part of the submission and would need to be reviewed again by experts in the field or by the agencies involved.
Yeah, I would add as well to that that the water source used can affect the final product quality. And what's important is your product testing, the stuff that Bill was talking about. You need to be able to pass microbial specifications, and those are dictated and standardized within markets. So there are certain specifications you have to pass. You can't have too much heavy metals. You can't have too much bacteria. But as long as you can pass those safety criteria, I wouldn't expect the production in wastewater to be problematic.
No, I think that's, you've hit it right on. I mean, it's the food supply. Don't ever forget that, so safety of the food supply is paramount. There's a lot of amazingly, just amazing innovations out there. So I don't want to, discount something just because it's wastewater. I mean, there's CO2, recapture technologies, all these sustainable technologies, these soft, benefits that are out there. So, I don't want to discount them from a regulatory perspective, without really understanding them. They might be quite viable as long as the end product is safe.
Would anyone else like to comment on that question? If not, there's another. Okay.
Just from a poultry company standpoint, you may get questioned on where your product originates from, just for that particular company's information. But and generally, it's not a big issue or concern.
Okay, great. So this is for both Zevo and NutriQuest. How do Zevo and NutriQuest see themselves operating in this market? Do you produce your own product, contract with producers, or do you license technology?
Andrew, if you want to take that from the supply side. And
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I see algal biomass primarily as a specialty ingredient. I don't see it going much farther beyond that for the foreseeable future. I'm sure that everybody's heard, 67 million tons of feed is consumed by poultry in the U.S. If you're only 1% of that feed mix, you've already outstripped the global production of algae by 1,000-fold. So, to talk about algae in anything more than a very minor component of the feed supply is not productive. I mean, it is going to always be, for the foreseeable future, just a specialty ingredient.
If a product has an active compound and mechanism of action, is that not biotech? And where's the line between an active compound and mechanism of action and biotech?
Valerie, let me start with this one because I think it came out of my discussion about mechanism of action. And I'll go back to, I've actually had to adjust my frame of mind on this. I'm coming out of pharma industry where we are producing isolated, purified active molecules for drug purposes. And to use an analogy that helped me when I joined Zevo, Andrew kept talking to me about selling an apple versus extracting something from the apple and selling that extracted compound. You know, the apple is good for you, and the apple a day keeps the doctor away, all of that stuff. The active compounds are in that apple, but you can sell an apple as a food and as an ag tech product. When you start to extract that active from it and purify it and then use it for something specific other than general health and nutrition, now you've crossed the line and you're getting into that biotech space. So for whole algal biomass added to animal feed, it's an ag tech product, and it's an ingredient or an additive. I'm never really good with the distinction between those two. But remember, I'm an algae outsider, I said to begin with. So, it's perfectly fine to know what your actives are so that you can properly optimize and control your product, as long as you're not selling it, as you're not selling that active, but you're selling the algae. That's how I keep the distinction separate.
Yeah, excellent. Are there different regulation standards for potential feed ingredients recovered as byproducts from algae biomass processing? For example, if you had an algae biomass and you were extracting lipids and then selling that extracted algae biomass, does that change anything from a regulation standpoint?
Well, that's its own product, regardless of how it's made. And it would have to go through the entire regulatory process, pretty much as a wholly new product.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, some of these products can be, come from different sources, but you still have to establish, your own grasp position or have your own regulatory position for the product itself that you're selling.
Yeah. Actually, at this point, we're out of time for continued discussion, but this has been a great discussion and an excellent set of presentations. I would like to thank all the panelists for your time today and your insightful presentations. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees for your time and your attention. I'll encourage any continued discussion with our panelists on the discussion board in the community tab in the Whova app, or you can contact them directly. Their contact information is in their in the attendee list. And I'd like to invite all of our attendees to please participate in our next Industry Spotlight panel, Managing Production Risk Through Crop Insurance, on Tuesday, September 1st at 10 a.m. Central Time. And thank you all very much. This has been a really great panel.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Stay safe.